Under the heavy branches of a sycamore tree that arched over the front porch like a guardian of solitude, Oliver Blaine adjusted the strap of his rifle case and stepped back into the cool shadow of his home. The early light spilled across the dry gravel road that led to his gate, an unpaved line between his land and everything he had deliberately moved away from. His house, modest but solid, stood on 3 acres of land bordered by oak, cactus, and a dry creek bed that came to life for a few weeks each spring. It was land he had bought not just with money, but with clarity. After 32 years of work in civil surveying, Oliver knew better than most where boundaries began and where they ended, not only the physical ones, but the invisible kind that people so often ignored. He chose this parcel precisely because it sat outside the reach of local subdivisions, community boards, neighborhood committees, and their endless rulebooks. There were no monthly dues, no approved color palettes, and no one to tell him what kind of mailbox he could install or how long his grass was allowed to be. It was a rare patch of space untouched by the grasp of creeping communal oversight, and he guarded it with the kind of quiet intensity that only a man who had spent decades reading the fine print could appreciate. Oliver wasn't a recluse. He wasn't angry at the world or disillusioned by society. He simply believed that people should have the right to live with dignity and peace without interference. He was polite, reserved, and self-sufficient, which often translated to suspicious loner in the eyes of people who didn't understand men like him. He greeted the few neighbors who lived scattered around the outskirts of the canyon with a nod and a wave when he passed them at the gas station or local hardware store. But he never attended barbecues or neighborhood brunches, and he didn't pretend to care about the local book club or who had the best garden. He had his routines. Mondays and Fridays were range days. Not at a public facility, not some crowded commercial indoor range with paper targets and rental pistols, but at the firing line he had personally constructed on the eastern edge of his land. He had installed a high dirt berm, rubber mulch traps, angled barriers to reduce echo, and even ran a decibel meter during construction to make sure his setup wouldn't create excessive noise beyond his fence line. He logged everything: dates, hours, duration of sessions, and ballistics, part of the habit of a man used to documentation and precision. He had the proper permits for his firearms, and the range itself had been informally reviewed by a local safety consultant he'd worked with in the past. Not because he was required to do so, but because Oliver did not leave room for error. Not when it came to land, not when it came to law, and certainly not when it came to his right to defend himself in his home, should it ever come to that. The problems began quietly, as they always do. A new resident moved into the subdivided property just south of his land, but a corner lot house built in the early 2000s that had recently been purchased after sitting empty for nearly a year. It wasn't the house that drew attention, it was the woman who came with it. Her name was Karen Ashcroft, and she was the type of neighbor Oliver had intentionally chosen this property to avoid. She was the new self-appointed head of what she called the Cedar Hill Community Association. Though Oliver's property was not, had never been, and would never be part of any such association. That fact didn't seem to matter to Karen. She arrived with printed newsletters, QR codes linking to block initiatives, and a clipboard she carried like a badge of office. She didn't knock on Oliver's door the first week she stood just outside his fence line, instead, peering over with hands on her hips like she was measuring the land with her eyes. Oliver ignored her. She returned 2 days later, same spot, same posture. This time she called out to him across the dry space between their properties. "Excuse me, sir. Are you aware that we're establishing a noise protocol for weekend hours?" He had been raking leaves near the porch, and he paused just long enough to answer without looking up. "I'm not part of your group." She blinked as if the words didn't compute. "Well, this area is being reintegrated into the larger community perimeter. We're drafting a shared use easement for the creek bed, and this land isn't under your jurisdiction," Oliver interrupted, still calm. It never was. It was excluded when this parcel was subdivided in 1991. You can check the county maps. That should have been the end of it. But with people like Karen, no was never a conclusion, it was an invitation to escalate. Within a week, Oliver began noticing small but deliberate provocations. Someone left a stack of printed HOA pamphlets inside his mailbox. A community concern notice was pinned to his fence with a thumbtack. It listed his property as a disruptive site due to irregular sound emissions. There was no logo, no formal letterhead, just bold black text on a sheet of printer paper. A quiet Saturday morning found him standing on his porch, watching as a young man in a fluorescent vest stopped at the edge of his driveway, held up a phone, took a picture of his range markers, and then turned and walked away without a word. That afternoon, Oliver documented the incident, saved the security footage, and emailed it to his lawyer not because he was worried, but because this was how it started. Not with lawsuits, but with whispers. Not with facts, but with implications. Karen's first direct confrontation came the following Thursday. Oliver had just finished his scheduled target practice session, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the ridge. He was packing up his equipment when he saw her standing just past his fence, arms crossed, with an air of mock civility. "I'm going to have to ask you to cease firearm activity until we can verify your compliance with neighborhood standards," she said, her voice falsely polite. Oliver turned, looked at her, and replied evenly, "I don't need your permission to use my land, nor do I answer to your neighborhood. You're not law enforcement." She stepped forward, toeing the edge of the property line with a rehearsed expression of concern. "We've received multiple complaints. Elderly residents have reported feeling unsafe. Children can hear the shots from their bedrooms." Oliver remained silent for a moment, watching her. "There are no houses within 500 feet of this range, and there are no children living within hearing distance. I have the sound maps to prove it." Karen's smile tightened. "We'll see what the sheriff's office has to say." That night, Oliver didn't sleep well, not from fear, but from calculation. He knew the law was on his side. He also knew that people like Karen didn't need legal authority to create chaos. All they needed was persistence and enough gray areas to exploit. He reviewed his permits again, rechecked the zoning maps, and printed copies of every document he might need. The next morning, he made a quiet call to a real estate attorney he trusted, someone who had worked on rural land disputes and understood the language of easements, boundaries, and enforcement rights. They talked for over an hour, and by the end of the call, Oliver had a folder on his desk with a new label, Ashcroft Issue. It was more than a precaution, it was the beginning of a countermeasure. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing to be left alone. For a few days there was silence, no visits, no flyers, no strange figures at the fence. But Oliver had the distinct feeling that this was not resolution, it was regrouping. And he was right, because what came next wasn't a complaint or a note or a quiet word. What came next was a knock on the door, followed by the clipped voice of a deputy who said, "Sir, we received a report of illegal firearms use on your property. We'll need to see some identification." The deputy at the door was young, probably no older than 30, with a pressed uniform and the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was either fresh from academy training or still clinging tightly to protocol. His expression wasn't hostile, just controlled, professional, but there was something in his eyes that hinted at the tension beneath. Oliver opened the door calmly, stepping back just enough to avoid making the moment feel adversarial. "You're responding to a call from Karen Ashcroft," he said, not asking, but stating. The deputy gave the briefest of nods. "We received a complaint about unpermitted discharge of firearms on residential property," he replied. "Under County Code 614 billion, such activity is prohibited within zones marked as communal residence areas. We're here to determine if that code applies in your case." Oliver had expected this. He already had a thin folder in hand, which he passed forward without speaking. Inside were photocopies of his property deed, zoning designation documents, maps, and his firearms and range permits, all reviewed, printed, and ready. The deputy took the folder and glanced over the contents with a focused seriousness, flipping pages and stopping occasionally to scan a paragraph or match a parcel number. A second deputy stood quietly behind the first, more relaxed, clearly the older of the two, with the kind of sun-weathered skin and tired patience that came from decades of responding to disputes that never belonged to the badge in the first place. After a minute, the younger one looked up. "Your property is outside of the Cedar Hill zone," he confirmed. "This address is marked as an independent parcel with no municipal attachment or governing residential committee." He hesitated, clearly trying to find a diplomatic tone. However, complaints regarding sound levels and safety protocols still require follow-up. Oliver nodded. "I understand. You'll find in the packet the decibel readings recorded on range days, as well as my target placement and the berm construction specs. Everything was built to federal safety standards. And there's no line of fire that extends beyond my property. I've also run compliance checks annually." The older deputy spoke for the first time, his voice low but firm. "We'll file this report as a non-violation. But Mr. Blaine, just so you know, some residents get nervous when they hear gunfire, even if it's legal. You might want to consider adjusting your hours or posting a range use notice at your gate." Oliver looked him in the eye. "I understand the concern, but fear doesn't override legal rights. I'm not disturbing anyone who lives close enough to be genuinely affected." The deputy gave a small shrug and nodded. "Fair enough. Just keep your paperwork close. These calls have a way of repeating themselves." When they left, Oliver stood at the threshold a moment longer, watching the dust rise behind the patrol SUV as it disappeared down the county road. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but he felt the undercurrent shift. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the first chess move. Karen hadn't knocked, hadn't argued, hadn't tried to mediate. She had gone straight to law enforcement with the language of legal violations, gambling on the assumption that the presence of police would intimidate or pressure him into conceding. And it would have if he were someone else. Someone who didn't know how the system worked. Someone who hadn't spent years mapping parcels and memorizing land use codes. Someone who didn't think. Be ahead. But Oliver wasn't just someone with a rifle and an opinion. He was a man who built his life around the principle that if you knew the terrain better than your enemy, you always had the advantage. Still, advantage or not, he knew this wasn't over. The sheriff's office had treated the visit as routine, but the very fact that it had happened opened a door. Now there was a record. Now there was precedent. And Karen, armed with her web of pseudo-legal newsletters and concerned citizen meetings, would no doubt interpret their visit as validation. He expected the next wave to be more subtle. Flyers, perhaps. Neighborhood notices misdelivered to his mailbox. Conversations at the local cafe where his name would be mentioned in the same sentence as words like dangerous, aggressive, or unstable. People like Karen understood that official power didn't always come from government. It came from public perception, from erosion, from the slow drip of social pressure that wore down resistance until a man gave in, not because he was wrong, but because he was tired. 3 days later, a white sedan with tinted windows pulled into the dirt shoulder just beyond Oliver's fence. A woman stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began photographing the front of his property. She didn't approach. She didn't knock. She took a dozen shots in under 5 minutes, then returned to her car and drove off. Oliver was inside when it happened, watching through the window. He didn't confront her. He took his own photos of her vehicle, wrote down the license plate, and filed a brief summary to his attorney. He wasn't paranoid, he was methodical. And something about this had the stink of coordination. It wasn't just Karen's doing. It was the rhythm of something organized. This was the next act in a slow, procedural ambush dressed up as civic concern. The following Monday, a manila envelope appeared in his mailbox unmarked, no return address. Inside was a printed letter from a so-called Community Integrity Initiative, requesting that Oliver submit documentation proving his firearms activity was licensed and not in violation of residential statutes regarding civilian ordnance discharge. The language was professional, but loaded with implication. No government seal, no legal header. just bold titles and a threatening tone. The letter claimed that until confirmation is received, your current activity shall be treated as unregulated and potentially unlawful. Oliver folded the letter carefully, slid it into his legal file, and scanned it to send to his lawyer. He included a short note, "It's starting." His attorney replied within the hour. The letter was not from any recognized county or state agency. It was a private letter attempting to mimic the style of formal legal correspondence, likely sent to pressure him into a concession. The advice was simple: do not respond directly, do not engage, and continue maintaining formal records of all correspondence, visits, and communications. Their strategy relies on escalation, the lawyer wrote. If you respond emotionally, they win. Stay disciplined. So he did. That week, he added a new sign to the entrance of his property, "Private property monitored, not under residential committee oversight." It wasn't aggressive, it was factual. He updated his surveillance system, adjusted camera angles to cover all fence lines, and began logging daily activity with timestamps. He wasn't preparing for a war, but for something worse, a slow siege. One where every minor inconvenience, every strange encounter, every passive-aggressive note was part of a broader campaign to make him feel surrounded. It was Thursday morning when the first real crack appeared. Oliver received a certified envelope from the county clerk's office. Inside was a formal notice of review regarding a land use query submitted by a member of the local advisory board. It referenced his address, his parcel number, and cited concerns over unregulated recreational activity on land potentially subject to common use environmental ordinances. The query wasn't a legal order. It wasn't a violation notice. It was a bureaucratic red flag, a prelude. Someone had tried to trigger a formal investigation by suggesting that his land fell under environmental oversight. It was flimsy. It wouldn't hold. But it meant someone had taken the time to dig through municipal code to find a loophole or ambiguity that could be exploited. This wasn't amateur pressure. This was someone using the system not to enforce rules, but to weaponize them. Oliver stared at the document for a long time, feeling the weight of it not because he feared its contents, but because he understood what it represented. It was an attempt to redefine the ground beneath his feet, to redraw lines that had long been settled, to suggest that facts were flexible if enough paper pushed against them. He called his lawyer again. The advice didn't change. "They're testing you," the lawyer said, "trying to see if you'll fold or fight. You're doing everything right, but be ready for them to get creative." That night, Oliver walked the perimeter of his property under the cold light of a waning moon, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the wind pushing dry leaves across the path. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert. Not to danger, but to intent. People like Karen didn't stop when they hit walls. They climbed, tunneled, chipped away, or called for reinforcements. She wasn't working alone anymore. That much was clear. The question now wasn't whether she'd escalate, but how far she'd be willing to go. And as he stood beneath the sycamore tree at the edge of his yard, watching headlights crawl slowly down the road before disappearing into the dark, he knew without a doubt that the next move would not be polite. It would not come in an envelope or a knock on the door. It would come with authority, or at least the appearance of it, because that's how these battles were fought now, not with logic, not with truth, but with pressure and process, and the hope that enough of both would break a man before he had the chance to push back. It began with a drone. At first, Oliver thought it was just another delivery quadcopter, Amazon, UP, even a surveying team documenting flood patterns in the valley. The hum was faint, a distant whine weaving through the canyon air like a mosquito that hadn't yet chosen its target. But when the sound didn't fade, when it lingered and repositioned and returned again the next morning at nearly the same time, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. The third time it came, he was ready. He stood by the edge of the porch with binoculars in one hand and a notepad in the other. The drone hovered in place for nearly 5 minutes, shifting slightly left and right, its camera gimbal visibly tilting as it scanned his range, his tool shed, even the slope of the berm he had constructed. He made note of the time, direction of approach, and general flight pattern. Then he went inside, downloaded the footage from his own cameras, and sent everything including the screenshots to his attorney. The response came the next day. No HOA registration tied to commercial use in that airspace during the reported hours, his lawyer wrote. Private operator. Possibly unlicensed. Consider reporting to local sheriff and county aviation. Oliver didn't need to be told twice. He filed a formal report, included all relevant documentation, and added it to what was now a growing binder labeled encroachment events. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he knew how quickly people turned accusations into action when they believed the law could be bent by enough persistence. And more importantly, he knew Karen wasn't simply annoyed anymore. She was organizing. That theory was confirmed the following week when Oliver received an official-looking letter from a company calling itself Cedar Compliance Group. The envelope was printed on smooth paper, thick and high quality, and the return address led to an office suite number in a nearby business park. Inside, the letter accused Oliver of operating a non-permitted training facility and demanded he cease all firearms activity until an independent compliance audit could be performed. The signature at the bottom was from someone named Max D. Holloway, listed as Chief Community Risk Officer. The tone was direct, professional, but not legally binding. There were no county stamps, no enforcement codes, no official capacity whatsoever. Just manufactured language designed to sound regulatory to the untrained eye. Oliver wasn't untrained. He scanned the document, highlighted the vague phrases perceived risk, environmental disruption. He inferred communal jurisdiction and wrote a detailed rebuttal, which he forwarded to both his lawyer and the county assessor's office with a note. This entity is falsely claiming oversight on private land. The assessor replied the same day. Cedar Compliance Group had no jurisdictional authority, no record of formal contracts with any city or county agency, and no standing to conduct audits of any kind. Their business license categorized them as a civic consulting firm, a category often used by HOAs and community organizations seeking to outsource enforcement-like activity to third-party agencies that could act without the full burden of public oversight. In other words, Karen had hired a paper shield with a corporate name. It would have been laughable if it weren't so precise. These weren't vague threats anymore. They were systemic maneuvers, each one crafted to plant doubt, to create fear of potential consequences, to make Oliver question whether it was worth the trouble. And they were coordinated. Karen, through her supposed association, was laying down a network of fictional authority, surrounding him not with fences but with paperwork, ambiguity, and bureaucracy that most people wouldn't know how to fight. But Oliver knew. He spent his life navigating land disputes, border discrepancies, and legal abstractions dressed as regulation. And he wasn't about to yield to some pretend marshal with a clipboard and a fake badge. Still, the strain was real. Every day seemed to bring a new intrusion. One morning, a man in a reflective vest approached his driveway, claiming to be a municipal surveyor. When Oliver asked for credentials, the man hesitated, then handed over a laminated badge that bore the name of a landscaping company with no connection to any official department. Oliver didn't escalate. He asked the man to leave. The man refused. So Oliver called the sheriff. The deputy arrived 20 minutes later, reviewed the interaction, and escorted the trespasser off the property with a quiet warning. There was no citation, no confrontation. But the message was clear. They were testing boundaries figuratively and literally. The psychological weight of that kind of harassment is difficult to describe. It doesn't come all at once. It creeps in. You stop sleeping well. You pause before opening the mailbox. You begin to expect noise where there should be silence. Oliver caught himself one morning hesitating before stepping outside. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. Tired of looking over his shoulder. Tired of checking the corners of his land for signs, markers, flyers, or trash. Tired of playing defense against people who wouldn't declare themselves directly. And yet he kept going. He maintained his logs. He updated his files. He scheduled a meeting with his lawyer in person, not over email, and brought with him 3 organized binders detailing every incident, correspondence, and interaction since the beginning of the dispute. The meeting changed everything. His lawyer, a seasoned land rights specialist named Jonathan McCabe, listened without interruption as Oliver laid out the progression. When it was over, McCabe leaned back in his chair and spoke with the measured calm of a man who had seen this kind of warfare before. "They're baiting you," he said. "They're hoping you respond emotionally. If you snap, if you shout at the wrong person, if you wave your firearm even once out of frustration, they'll have what they need to push a criminal narrative. That's the end game. Not paperwork. Not compliance. They want escalation." Oliver nodded, but something in McCabe's tone felt unfinished. "And?" he asked. McCabe paused. "And I think they're trying to set legal precedent. If they can create the illusion that your land is de facto part of their district, even without formal annexation, and you fail to respond to their notices, they can make a case for assumed jurisdiction. It's not legally binding. But it's enough to gum up the works, tie you up in court, drain your resources. By the time you win, you've already lost years and peace of mind." That night, Oliver didn't return home right away. He drove through the back roads of the county, winding between ridgelines and dry riverbeds, letting the silence of the landscape remind him of why he chose this life in the first place. He didn't move out here to escape people. He moved to live on his terms. With structure, yes, but not someone else's. With rules, but rules he agreed to when he bought the land. As he crested a hill and looked out across the dusky sprawl of valleys below, he made a decision. He wasn't going to just defend himself. He was going to start documenting them. Every flyer, every drone, every car that lingered too long near his fence. Not with suspicion, but with proof. Because people like Karen didn't stop when you argued with them. They stopped when they got caught. 2 days later, the confrontation happened. Oliver had been working near the back edge of his property, inspecting a small washout that had deepened during recent rains. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate. By the time he reached the front gate, Karen was already there, not outside the fence. Inside, she stood confidently in the center of his gravel path, arms folded, flanked by 2 men in navy blue polos with no names, no insignias, just matching clipboards and faint smirks. Oliver stopped 6 feet away. "You're trespassing," he said. Karen smiled. "We're conducting an assessment. According to our community charter, this land may fall under our revised expansion zone. We filed notice with the county." Oliver said nothing. He simply turned, walked back to his shed, returned with a laminated copy of the zoning map, and laid it on the hood of his truck. "This line," he said, pointing, "is the legal boundary. Your expansion doesn't touch my land. You know that." One of the clipboard men spoke. "Sir, you'll need to remove all target-related equipment from the premises pending review. If you refuse, we'll notify municipal code enforcement." Oliver tilted his head. "You're not enforcement. You have no authority here. And if you don't leave now, I'll call the sheriff and file for criminal trespass." Karen's smile didn't fade, but her eyes narrowed. "You're escalating, Oliver." He shook his head. "No, I'm responding." He called the sheriff. They left before the cruiser arrived, but the report was made. The footage captured. The perimeter marked and secured. And for the first time in weeks, Oliver felt not just surrounded but watched. Not the casual kind of attention that came from nosy neighbors. The kind that came from people who believed they had the right to correct you, to push you, to remake your life into something that fit their vision of what a neighborhood should be. And for the first time since this started, he wondered just how far they were willing to go to make that happen. A week passed in a tense, almost eerie quiet. There were no drones, no unmarked cars, no strange flyers zip-tied to the gate. The silence felt deliberate, not like retreat, but like a reset. Oliver continued his routine with the same discipline he had always upheld: early mornings spent walking the property line, mid-mornings reviewing the perimeter camera footage, afternoons divided between maintenance, correspondence with his attorney, and practical range time. He hadn't changed a single thing about how he lived or how he trained, refusing to allow the slow drip of manufactured tension to distort the reality he had built with his own hands. But beneath his calm exterior, he was aware that something was shifting. The campaign against him wasn't losing steam, it was recalibrating. The shift became evident when his attorney forwarded him an email with the subject line, "Boundary challenge filed." Someone, though the form didn't specify who, had submitted a formal petition to the county requesting a review of Oliver's parcel designation. The claim argued that due to outdated records and misaligned zoning grids, Oliver's property should be evaluated as potentially subject to overlay jurisdiction. It was a dense bureaucratic term that sounded harmless enough on paper, but in practice, it was an open invitation for a local board to start asking the kinds of questions that usually ended with redrawn lines and forced compliance. The petition referenced community interests, public safety, and regional consistency, but offered no evidence, no data, and no actual complaint from any affected party. It was the legal equivalent of throwing a net into the water and hoping it caught something big enough to drag to court. Jonathan McCabe, calm as ever, explained what it really meant during their next call. They're playing the long game. It's not about being right. It's about creating procedural fog. If the board approves a review, even if it leads nowhere, you'll be trapped in the system for months. Hearings, document requests, provisional orders, they'll use the process itself as punishment. Oliver sat at his desk, staring out the window toward the tall grasses swaying along his south fence line. "Can they win?" he asked. Jonathan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Eventually? Probably not. But if you're isolated, under pressure, and burned out, you might just give in. That's the bet they're making." It was that word, isolated, that stuck with him. Because that was exactly what Karen had been building since the beginning, not a legal case, but a framework of doubt and silence. One that didn't require truth to win, only momentum. She hadn't come at him with lawyers or cops, she'd come with whispers, forms, and administrative tricks dressed as procedure. And all of it operated on the unspoken assumption that he was alone, that no one would speak up, that no one would care. And for the most part, she'd been right. The handful of neighbors who lived within shouting distance of Oliver's land had remained neutral. They hadn't participated in the provocations, but they hadn't spoken out either. Most likely, they just didn't want trouble. But neutrality, in cases like this, had the same effect as complicity. Still, Oliver wasn't naive. He knew he couldn't fight perception alone. So he did something he hadn't done since the beginning of the conflict. He reached out. Not loudly. Not to stir drama, but to speak plainly. He stopped by a neighbor's home 2 properties over, a retired schoolteacher named Dennis, who had always been polite in passing but never especially warm. Oliver knocked, introduced himself properly, and said, "I'd like to ask for 10 minutes of your time." Dennis blinked in surprise but opened the door wider and gestured him inside. For coffee at the kitchen table, Oliver laid out the sequence of events. He didn't dramatize. He didn't frame Karen as a villain or paint himself as a victim. He just told the story the way it had happened, documented, timed, measured. When he finished, Dennis leaned back and said, "I knew she was stirring things up, but I didn't think it was like that." Then, more quietly, "She came by last week, asked me to sign a petition, said it was just about keeping the neighborhood safe. I didn't sign, but I didn't ask questions either." Oliver nodded. "I'm not here to collect allies, just trying to set the record straight." Dennis looked down at his cup. "You should talk to Marlene. She's seen more than she lets on." Over the next 3 days, Oliver visited 3 more neighbors. One by one, he told the same story, handed over printed summaries with attached documents, and left copies of the official zoning maps with his annotations. He didn't demand support. He didn't ask for statements. He only asked that they consider the facts before forming opinions based on rumor. The effect was subtle, but he felt it. Doors opened a little faster. The conversations lingered longer. Someone dropped off fresh produce from their garden with a note that simply read, "Thank you for the clarity." Then came the mediation request. An email arrived from a third-party firm offering to facilitate peaceful neighborhood resolutions regarding ongoing land use disputes. The sender claimed to represent both concerned parties and invited Oliver to attend a voluntary session at their downtown office. Attached was a list of issues that would be discussed, all of which mirrored Karen's talking points: safety, community cohesion, property consistency. But buried in the fine print was a clause that chilled him. It stated that by attending the session, both parties would agree to honor recommendations made by the mediator to the best of their ability, and in the spirit of mutual compromise. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a trap. Voluntary participation, followed by binding language disguised as friendly counsel. If Oliver agreed to any of it, even something benign like limiting hours of use on his range, it would set a precedent. Karen could point to the agreement and say he had acknowledged her group's authority. And from there, it wouldn't matter how illegal her methods were. She'd have the foothold she needed. He declined, formally and in writing. Then he took the step that marked the real midpoint of this fight. He filed a counterclaim. Working with McCabe, Oliver submitted a formal complaint to the county registrar and zoning authority, naming Cedar Compliance Group, Karen Ashcroft, and the unnamed individuals involved in the unlicensed drone operations. The complaint cited unauthorized surveillance, trespassing, fraudulent representation of government authority, and abuse of process. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a signal, a paper trail that showed he wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was drawing lines. For every letter they sent, he would answer with one of his own. For every trick, he'd counter with documentation, with legal procedure, with measured precision. 2 days later, the first ripple of that action surfaced. Karen showed up unannounced again. This time she stayed outside the gate, flanked by 2 different men in business attire. She didn't speak, didn't shout. She simply held up a sign, printed and laminated, that read, "Future Site of Cedar Hill Community Integration Boundary." She smiled, held it there for nearly 30 seconds, and then walked away. Oliver didn't say a word. He simply stepped outside, took a picture of the trio, printed it, time-stamped it, and filed it into his binder. He didn't need to confront her. Not anymore. He had finally understood that this wasn't a dispute over sound or even over guns. It was about dominion. About control. Karen didn't care about noise. She cared about power, about making the world outside her window conform to the one inside her head. And Oliver, by standing still, was challenging that illusion. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept through without waking once. Not because he felt safe, but because he finally felt like he wasn't just surviving the siege, he was responding. Strategically, legally, without shouting, without fear. There's facts. And that was something Karen couldn't outmaneuver. The following week began without incident, a stillness that might have passed for peace if not for the undertow of suspicion running beneath it. Oliver was no stranger to strategic pauses. In his years of surveying contentious land disputes, he'd learned that when the other side stopped moving, it wasn't always surrender, it was recalibration. And he was right to be cautious, because what followed wasn't another drone or a letter or a petition. It was something colder, more impersonal, and far more dangerous, a formal complaint filed with the County Code Enforcement Office, alleging multiple violations of environmental compliance statutes and requesting an immediate site inspection. The claim was anonymous, but the language was specific, and it contained internal referencing codes used almost exclusively by municipalities or contractors who dealt regularly with local zoning law. It accused Oliver of unlawful grading, disruption of protected soil layers, improper storage of hazardous materials, and unlicensed use of explosive ordnance, and accusation that he, while absurd, triggered mandatory involvement from the fire marshal's office. By the time the inspectors arrived, 2 vehicles, official IDs, full procedural clipboards in hand. Oliver was already standing at the edge of his property with every relevant document laid out in a waterproof case. He greeted them calmly, offered coffee, and said, "You're going to want to see this first." What followed was a 3-hour walk-through in which Oliver methodically debunked each claim. The grading was limited to erosion management, documented and permitted. There were no explosives, only standard rifle ammunition stored in a code-compliant, humidity-controlled steel locker. The so-called hazardous materials turned out to be fertilizer and paint thinner, both stored in their original containers with intact labels and seals. Every regulation had been followed to the letter. The officials, professional and courteous, took their notes, photographed everything, and agreed that the complaint lacked merit. But their presence alone had impact. Trucks on his road, strangers in uniform examining his home. It was the kind of scene that lingered in the minds of anyone watching. And Oliver knew there were eyes watching. The damage wasn't legal, it was social. Another seed of suspicion planted, another spectacle for Karen to twist into a narrative. The next morning, his mailbox held a letter not from the county but from a private property arbitration firm, a new name, unfamiliar branding, but the same sterile language of mediation. It began with, "Our office has been made aware of growing tensions between parties in the Cedar Hill region regarding property boundaries and safety concerns." It offered to facilitate a mutually agreeable resolution and help reduce the strain on public systems. The letter emphasized neutrality, but the attached summary of concerns was anything but. It referenced citizen reports of erratic behavior, discharge of weapons during vulnerable hours, and verbal threats made to civic volunteers. Oliver scanned it 3 times, trying to decide whether to laugh or feel insulted. There were no dates, no specifics, just vague allegations designed to look like a pattern. It was character assassination by bullet point. He sent it to McCabe, who called within the hour. "This isn't just nuisance lawfare anymore," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "They're preparing a record a soft case. These letters, reports, and complaints aren't for you. They're being accumulated so that if something ever goes wrong, if a fire starts nearby, if someone claims a noise complaint got ignored, they can say, 'We tried, we warned everyone, we documented his instability.'" Oliver sat in silence for a moment, staring at the tall pine that marked the northern edge of his land. "How do we counter that?" he asked. Jonathan sighed. "We file our own report, not just to the county but to the state ombudsman. A complaint of targeted harassment under the pretense of community oversight. We document the pattern, show the increasing frequency, and file a civil request for injunctive relief. If they escalate further, we're prepared." Oliver agreed, and for the next 48 hours his quiet life was replaced with a steady rhythm of documentation, phone calls, and notarized declarations. He installed 2 new security cameras, one near the southern fence line and another facing the dry creek bed, separated his property from the edge of Cedar Hill. Not because he expected an intruder, but because this was now a game of optics, and every angle mattered. He recorded himself walking the range, noting the placement of targets, the direction of fire, and the decibel levels at varying distances. He logged everything not out of fear, but because he understood the rules of engagement had changed. This wasn't about violations, it was about reputation, about drowning him in suspicion until the burden of constant defense wore him down. And then came the vandalism. It happened at night, sometime between midnight and 4 a.m. Oliver discovered it during his morning walk. The eastern fence had been cut in 2 places, clean slices likely made by bolt cutters. Inside, the training range had been trashed. Target stands broken, mulch scattered, and someone had spray-painted the berm wall with red letters, "We don't want your war here." No footprints, no tire tracks. Whoever did it knew how to avoid detection. Oliver's first instinct was to call the sheriff, but as his hand hovered over the phone, he paused. He knew how this would look. First came the compliance reports, then the inspection. Now vandalism. From the outside, it was starting to resemble chaos. And that was exactly what Karen wanted. So instead of calling immediately, he documented the scene in exhaustive detail. High-res photos, time-stamped videos, aerial footage from his own drone, flown at dawn to capture light-angle clarity. Then he called Jonathan. The attorney arrived 2 hours later in person, examined the damage, and agreed. It's staged. They're trying to frame you into reaction, maybe even a self-defense incident. Oliver nodded. I don't give them the show. They did report it, but cautiously. They framed it not as a criminal event, but as evidence in the ongoing harassment pattern. The deputy who arrived was the same one from earlier weeks, older, calm, respectful. He walked the range, took his own photos, and said, Mr. Blaine, off the record, you've got a real situation here. I'd recommend getting this in front of the county board. The whole board. Oliver nodded. We're working on it. The next move, however, wasn't Karen's, it was Oliver's. He requested a hearing with the county's Land Use Review Board, a public session where both parties could present documentation, not to seek judgment, but to officially place the dispute on record in a neutral setting. Karen received the notice and predictably appeared at the session with a small entourage, her usual clipboard men, 2 individuals from Cedar Compliance, and a local fire safety consultant whose presence suggested she was planning to argue public hazard. Oliver entered with Jonathan and a bound dossier several inches thick, organized chronologically and color-coded by incident type. The board, composed of 5 members, was used to dry disputes over fence lines and irrigation rights. They were not prepared for the war of paper that followed. Karen opened with an emotional appeal, claiming that Oliver's behavior disrupted community peace, that his refusal to cooperate endangered children, and that multiple residents had approached her in fear. She referenced letters, unnamed witnesses, and the damage to trust and cohesion. But she offered no evidence, no signed statements, no dates, just claims. When it was Oliver's turn, Jonathan handled the presentation. He spoke calmly, professionally, and presented each event with supporting documentation. The drone footage, the inspection reports, the vandalism, the complaint copies, the unauthorized letters masquerading as legal orders. He emphasized that Oliver had not once initiated a confrontation, had complied with all laws, and had sought only to be left alone on his own land. When the session ended, the board did not make a ruling. They said they would deliberate. But Oliver didn't need a verdict. He needed the record. And now it existed, not just in his binders, but in public minutes and official acknowledgement that he was being targeted under the guise of community safety. Karen's tactics, so far reliant on opacity, had just been dragged into light. But like any adversary who had tasted control, she did not retreat. 2 nights later, his perimeter alarm tripped. Not motion this time. A breach. The southwest gate had been forced open. When Oliver arrived, shotgun in hand, no one was there, but something had been left behind, a black flag tied to a piece of rebar, driven into the soil. On it was painted a crude symbol, not of a known group, but something that looked like a warning, an X over a rifle, surrounded by a circle. This was no longer just about Karen. Someone else was getting involved. And Oliver realized that the fight had entered a new phase, one that wouldn't be fought in hearings or letters alone. It was now about intimidation, endurance, and making sure they understood that he wasn't going anywhere. Because this land was his, and no amount of pressure, no matter how coordinated, would change that. The air was sharp that morning, the kind of dry cold that settled not on the skin but under it, threading through bone and breath alike. Oliver stood beneath the skeletal outline of his porch awning, eyes narrowed at the empty stretch of gravel beyond his gate. The symbol they had left 2 nights before had long been removed, but its message lingered in the atmosphere like the aftershocks of distant thunder. He hadn't slept well since, though not for fear. It wasn't terror that kept him from rest. It was anticipation. A quiet, coiled sense that something was coming. That the pacing of these provocations had changed, and whoever was behind them was no longer interested in making him look unstable or problematic. They wanted to rattle him, drive him to a mistake, or worse, bait him into conflict. And that meant the endgame was near. Over the next several days, Oliver noticed subtle changes around the perimeter of his property. Footprints just one set, heavy-soled, appeared in the dry grass near the west fence, too fresh to have come from his own patrol. One of the rear cameras caught a flicker of movement late at night, too far to identify, but clearly humanoid, crouched low near the irrigation ditch. A previously locked gate was found ajar one morning, its latch unclasped though still intact. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, but the message was clear: someone had been there. Close enough to listen, close enough to watch, close enough to decide, if they wanted, whether they would escalate this into something physical. Oliver did not flinch. He did not react publicly. But privately, he tripled his documentation, ran a full diagnostic on every security system, and moved several of his training targets indoors, but unwilling to provide even the faintest illusion of combat readiness that someone might try to misrepresent. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about precision. Jonathan called that Friday. The county board issued a recommendation, he said, voice clipped, jaw clearly tight. They're not ruling on the complaint, but they've suggested that you consider suspending all firearms activity until the boundaries are reaffirmed by the registrar's office. Oliver stared blankly at the horizon. Suggested? He repeated. Yes, Jonathan confirmed. Not mandated. Not enforceable. But you and I both know what that means. They're looking for quiet. Not justice. Not resolution. Just for things to stop making waves. Oliver exhaled slowly. And if I ignore it? Jonathan was quiet for a beat. Then they'll distance themselves. The board won't protect you when the next false report comes in. And it will. They're hoping you make this easy for them. But Oliver had never made things easy for people who tried to rewrite the rules mid-game. He had chosen this land precisely because it was not beholden to the illusions of communal governance. Because it was hard to reach, hard to control, hard to claim. And he had no intention of surrendering it to those who used formality as a weapon and process as a battering ram. So he didn't stop. He conducted his next range session with full transparency, time-stamped announcements to the sheriff's office, public posting of hours, decibel readings logged in real time. He left nothing to chance. If they were going to accuse him, they'd have to do so in direct contradiction of documented fact. 3 days later, someone did. A man claiming to be a county inspector arrived at Oliver's gate, flashing a laminate ID with an emblem Oliver didn't recognize. He asked to walk the property, citing a recent complaint about improper storage of regulated materials. Oliver, ever cautious, asked for written authorization. The man hesitated, then said it was an emergency inquiry. That was the wrong answer. Oliver called the sheriff's office while the man stood at the gate, and within 20 minutes, a marked unit pulled up behind the inspector's sedan. The responding deputy reviewed the ID, ran a check, and discovered that while the name was real, the badge had been revoked 6 months earlier for impersonation of authority outside designated roles. The man was detained. Oliver, for the first time, allowed himself to feel something close to triumph. But it was short-lived. That night, his property was hit again. Not with vandalism this time, but with noise. Speakers, 4 of them, were planted just beyond his fence, hidden behind brush and rocks. At exactly 2:15 a.m., they began to blare audio, distorted gunshots, looped screams, and what sounded like synthetic explosions. It lasted 6 minutes before Oliver found and disconnected them. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He simply sat at his kitchen table, writing everything down: times, sounds, decibel levels, battery types, speaker model numbers. He collected the evidence and took photographs. The next morning, he delivered them in person to the sheriff's office and requested an investigation into targeted psychological harassment. The deputy on duty promised to escalate it to the district attorney. but Karen struck before the law could catch up. That evening, an emergency injunction was filed with the county court, this time not against Oliver's land use, but against Oliver himself. Karen's affidavit claimed she feared for her safety, citing erratic behavior, aggressive posturing, and a growing arsenal of firearms that she believed constituted an imminent threat to community stability. She backed her claims with misquoted emails, cropped images of Oliver holding a rifle, and third-party statements from members of her neighborhood committee, all alleging that Oliver had spoken of defending his land by any means necessary. It was slander. Worse, it was dangerous slander. The judge, caught between public pressure and legal ambiguity, issued a temporary civil order restricting Oliver from engaging in any activity perceived as threatening within visible range of the Cedar Hill border. It wasn't a conviction. It wasn't even enforceable beyond the realm of civil court. But it was a stain, a headline waiting to happen, a label applied without proof. And that, Oliver realized, had been the goal from the beginning. Not to win in court, but to taint him in the eyes of the institutions he relied on. So he responded not with rage, but with restraint. He and Jonathan filed a formal countersuit for defamation and abuse of process. They included affidavits from multiple neighbors who had now grown tired of Karen's methods, several of whom were willing to testify that her campaign had begun before she ever claimed to feel unsafe. They presented audio recordings, video documentation, and evidence of manipulated photos. They showed how complaints had been filed in clusters, often using the same language across multiple reports, a clear indication of coordination. And they backed it all with the results of a forensic report that traced the anonymous harassment letters to a shared printer used by Cedar Compliance Group. The hearing date was set. In the days leading up to it, Oliver's property remained quiet. The gate stayed closed. No more flyers, no more inspectors. Karen had gone silent, or perhaps she was merely waiting. But Oliver was ready now, not just in documentation, but in spirit. He had endured the slow poison of bureaucratic warfare, the smears, the trespasses, the psychological games. And he had survived with his dignity intact, his composure unbroken. The courtroom was small, sterile, lit with flickering fluorescents and flanked by rows of uncomfortable benches. Karen arrived dressed in beige, calm-faced, flanked by a young attorney with too many tabs in his binder and not enough experience behind his eyes. Oliver entered quietly, alone but composed, his suit clean, his voice steady. Jonathan did the talking, but Oliver's presence spoke for itself. When the judge asked him directly if he had ever threatened anyone, his reply was simple: "I've defended my land. I've obeyed the law. I've asked to be left alone." If someone feels threatened by that, they're afraid of something that has nothing to do with me. The judge did not issue a ruling that day, but his tone was unmistakable. He chastised Karen's legal team for failing to provide direct evidence. He questioned the credibility of her sources. He acknowledged the troubling pattern of unverified accusations and asked whether this community initiative had exceeded its intended purpose. By the time Oliver left the building, the tension that had wrapped around his chest for weeks began to unspool, not completely, but enough to breathe without calculation. He didn't feel victorious. He felt vindicated. He had stood in front of the machine that tried to rewrite his reality, and he had spoken clearly, without bending, without breaking. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The finality came not in a court ruling or a public apology, but in the quiet erosion of Karen Ashcroft's campaign. Following the hearing, something shifted in the tone of her crusade. The affidavits presented by Oliver's legal team, the forensic evidence connecting the anonymous harassment to a printer inside her civic consultant's office, and the outright dismissal of her emergency injunction had done more than defend Oliver's legal position. They had dismantled the illusion of her authority. In the following days, her presence around the neighborhood grew sparse. The clipboard she once carried like a weapon of governance was replaced by a vague absence. She stopped calling meetings. Her small circle of community volunteers evaporated without confrontation, as if their allegiance had never really been to her but to the idea of control she once symbolized. The flyers stopped. The letters stopped. The inspectors, the noise traps, the vague threats veiled in official formatting, all of it disappeared. It didn't happen dramatically. It simply withered, day by day, until there was nothing left. Oliver continued his routines. He maintained his range discreetly but without apology. His training continued, documented, timed, and within the bounds of the law. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. The conflict that had consumed weeks of his life had become part of a permanent record now, not just in court archives but in the collective understanding of his neighbors. The same people who once watched silently from behind closed windows now greeted him with nods, brief waves, even small exchanges of words at the local co-op or during garbage collection days. No one apologized directly, and he didn't expect them to. Their shift in demeanor was enough. Respect, in places like this, often came quietly, without confession. Karen eventually resigned from her position within the neighborhood committee. The resignation was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no farewell gathering. Her name simply vanished from the online directories, and her newsletter, once distributed weekly through physical mailboxes, ceased to appear. Oliver later learned through a neighbor that she had quietly listed her home for sale. Within 6 weeks, the for sale sign appeared on her lawn, discreet and professional, placed not by her hand but by a local real estate firm that specialized in exit strategies for problematic properties. She left without ceremony, early one Saturday morning, a moving truck idling on her driveway as 2 young men loaded boxes. She didn't wave goodbye. Oliver didn't expect her to. The hearing had not ended in a dramatic judgment in his favor, but it had accomplished something greater. It had frozen the machinery Karen had tried to build. Without her orchestrating the narrative, there was no longer a unified story about Oliver being a menace, a threat, a renegade with weapons. What remained was a man who had been methodical, composed, and relentlessly factual in his defense of himself and his land. He had not stooped to their level. He had not retaliated, exaggerated, or lost control. And in a world built on perception, that kind of consistency was unassailable. By early spring, the air had changed. The tension that had once hovered around the edges of Oliver's property like storm clouds now dissipated into a kind of uneasy peace. The county board quietly closed the overlay jurisdiction review, citing lack of sufficient grounds. The so-called Cedar Compliance Group ceased its activity in the area. Their offices shuttered just weeks after their credibility had been publicly questioned during Oliver's countersuit. His attorney, Jonathan, filed a final summary with the registrar's office, an official declaration that no future challenges would be tolerated without evidence that passed the threshold of formal investigation. That document was logged, stamped, and entered into the parcel's permanent record. From that point forward, any attempt to interfere with Oliver's land rights would be met not with review, but with automatic rejection. The final action Oliver took was personal, though symbolic. He replaced the simple private property sign on his gate with something quieter, more deliberate, a single bronze plaque, etched with clean serif letters that read, "Unincorporated land. Legally verified. No committee oversight." It wasn't for show. It wasn't defiance. It was simply truth, set in metal. No more ambiguity, no more suggestion of inclusion. The lines were no longer invisible. They were cast, literal and permanent. Life returned to its rhythm. Oliver adjusted his training schedule slightly, not out of fear, but to reclaim the sense of control that had once been disrupted. He expanded the garden behind his house, a decision he hadn't planned on but found surprisingly rewarding. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, and squash replaced a once dormant patch of earth near the tool shed. He reinstalled the perimeter lights that had once been damaged, added motion sensors in key areas, and trimmed back the overgrowth along the creek where he'd first found the black flag. Nothing had happened there since, but he still didn't trust the quiet entirely. Then, one afternoon, while he was repairing a section of the split-rail fence near the east side of the property, A county sheriff's vehicle pulled into the road. It wasn't the older deputy he'd grown accustomed to, but someone new, a younger officer, polite, even deferential. He stepped out of the car with a clipboard in hand and a tired smile. "Mr. Blaine," he said, "I was asked to do a follow-up check on the final closure of your civil countersuit." Oliver wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Everything resolved?" The officer chuckled. "You're officially considered low risk for further dispute." "That's bureaucratic speak for, we're done here." He handed Oliver a stamped copy of the final review, shook his hand, and left. Oliver stood there for a moment after the car disappeared, the wind brushing over the tall grass like a hand smoothing fabric. He thought about everything that had happened, the escalation, the accusations, the surreal experience of watching his private world become someone else's battlefield. And yet, somehow, it had ended with something he hadn't expected to feel again: clarity. Not just legal, but moral. He hadn't sought conflict. He hadn't lashed out. He had refused to let chaos define him. In doing so, he had reclaimed something deeper than land. He had reclaimed his right to silence, to stillness, to live without narration from others. As evening fell, he walked his perimeter one last time, not out of habit, but as a kind of ritual. The dry leaves crunched beneath his boots, the cicadas buzzed low in the fading heat, and the smell of turned earth lingered from the day's work. There were no watchers now, no eyes beyond the fence. Just the soft, rustling rhythm of wind through trees and the quiet certainty that the battle had ended exactly the way it was meant to, not with a bang or spectacle, but with truth holding its ground until lies simply ran out of breath. And for Oliver Blaine, that was enough.